In Magic the Gathering, when you play an artifact, you're doing it because you hope that artifact can help you win the game by having some sort of positive impact. Artifacts have a lot of diverse effects. They can be creatures, they can kill something, they can produce mana, and they can give you a lot of other useful effects that are worth spending mana and a card on. However, not all artifacts are able to achieve this, and in fact, casting many artifacts is a losing proposition, either because they make you use up resources for no good reason, or because they actively lead to you losing the game. Most of my MTG top 10s have an overarching category, like the worst artifact creatures or the worst mana rocks, and those are top 10s I've done if you're interested. But this video is a little bit different from what I typically do, because instead of being a list of the worst cards in a single category, I decided it'd be interesting to instead give you my pick for the worst artifact at each mana value 0 to 10, like I've done recently with both creatures and sorceries. So, rather than being a top 10 list where cards in the same category get progressively worse, this is kinda just a parade of terrible cards. Think of it as the worst artifact you could possibly play on each of your turns. Let's get started. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want Magic singles or sealed product, use my link in the description. Let's start at 0 mana. For my other top 10s that look at the worst cards of a given type at each mana value, many people in the comments have suggested I also look at a 0 mana card. My reason for not doing that was that this series is called MTG Top 10, and that would mean that the list had more than 10 cards, but ultimately, I decided it was a good idea, because it's an interesting exercise to think about cards that are bad, despite being free. And I've actually done a top 10 on the worst 0 mana cards in the past, if you're interested in more of that. But for now, let me give you my pick for the worst 0 mana artifact in Magic, Delif's Cone. So, you might be thinking that if something costs 0 mana, you really shouldn't expect much out of it, and that's true to an extent. After all, there are lots of 0 mana artifacts that are good simply because they are 0 mana artifacts that give you some minor effect, like the various baubles. But the big difference with those cards is that they actually replace themselves. Delif's Cone can't say the same, because its effect is both extremely narrow and extremely underpowered. And remember, cards are a resource too, and this is a card that you use up. You can tap and sacrifice the Cone, and then, this turn, when target creature you control attacks and isn't blocked, you may gain life equal to its power, and if you do, it assigns no combat damage this turn. That's right, this card is useless unless you have an attacker get through, and even once you do have that attacker get in, the only upside is gaining some life, and isn't even really upside since you forgo doing damage to gain said life. Basically, it grants the worst version of lifelink ever. In other words, all Delif's Cone has going for it is that it's a free artifact, but it does nothing 99% of the time, and on the occasions it does do something, what it does is so minor that it's not remotely worth the card, even when you account for artifact synergies and the like. This might cost 0 mana, but it's not even worth that. That said, even with all those problems, being a 0 mana artifact comes with enough inherent value that Delif's Cone might be the best card on this list, and that's pretty bad because it's still awful. I think the worst 1 mana artifact is Juju Bubble. Once again, maybe we shouldn't expect a ton from our 1 mana artifacts, right? But we should expect an artifact that, matters, and doesn't come with some significant downside. Juju Bubble fails on both accounts. It has an activated ability that costs 2 generic, and you gain 1 life. If we stop there, this would be a decent card. I mean, it's usually better to add to the board than it is to sink your mana to something that gains you 1 life at a time, but at least it's a cheap artifact that gives you something to do with your mana. You could do a whole lot worse. And playing this does mean you do a whole lot worse because Juju Bubble comes with 2 massive downsides. First, it has cumulative upkeep. This mechanic means that during each of your upkeeps, you put a time counter on this permanent, and then you pay the upkeep cost for each time counter on it. So for Juju Bubble, you pay 1 mana on that first upkeep, then 2, then 3, and so on. In other words, that mana you were hoping to spend to raise your life total quickly gets consumed by this card's upkeep cost. That's why it's baffling that they gave it an additional downside, and that is, if you play a card, you have to sacrifice the bubble. Note that it says play, which means just playing a land makes you sacrifice it too. So yeah, this card that is super hungry for mana, both to keep it in play and pay its upkeep cost, doesn't let you do anything else at all. That makes it a lot harder to do anything meaningful with Juju Bubble. There's basically no way for you to get more mana after it enters without getting rid of it. The one thing the bubble does have going for it is that if you generate infinite mana, you can sink it in to gain as much life as you want, But there are literally hundreds of better things you can do with infinite mana. You don't want to be using a card that is this narrow and this useless when you don't get your infinite mana online. And I mean, there are a whole lot of terrible cards that can be good when you have infinite mana, but that's because you have infinite mana, not because of how good the card you're spending it on is. I think the worst 2-mana artifact is Parallax Inhibitor. You can pay 1 generic and tap it and sacrifice it to put a fade counter on each permanent with fading you control. So to start with, this has incredibly narrow upside. Fading is a mechanic that's appeared on a total of 18 cards, and it's a mechanic where if something has fading, it enters with a number of those fade counters on it, and you remove one of them at the beginning of your upkeep, and if you can't, you sacrifice it. So in other words, the inhibitor gives these cards one additional turn in play. You might think that in a fading-centric deck that would mean the inhibitor was pretty good, but it just wasn't. Several cards with fading have made their mark on competitive Magic. I even have an MTG top 10 on them. But no one who was trying to win ever played Parallax Inhibitor, even if their deck had multiple fading cards in it. That's because it's simply not worth the card and 3 total mana to make these fading creatures and other permanents stick around for one more turn. You go down a card and don't get much of a payback in return. It's a real shame that they made this design so parasitic, meaning that it really only works with one little used mechanic that really only appears in a single block. Because if they decided to make this work with any kind of counter, sort of like a proliferate effect, it would have been markedly better. But as it is, it only works with one thing, and it isn't even worth using in a deck that is all about that one thing. That's a really big indictment on a card. It's not just that it's narrow, it's that it wasn't even good when you were in its super specific corner case, and that's what makes this the worst 2-mana artifact ever printed. Let's move to 3 mana now. For every mana cost on this list, I actually had a pretty easy time coming up with my pick, as I felt there was one card that was head and shoulders below all the rest, but that wasn't true for 3 mana, where I had a super hard time picking the worst one. Flowstone Armor and Rejuvenation Chamber both almost ended up here. Funnily enough, the Armor and Chamber are both from the same set as Parallax Inhibitor, Nemesis, and they're both also really bad. That set has a lot of terrible cards. Anyway, the Armor costs 3 to cast, and you can pay 3 generic and tap it to give something +1/-1, and you can choose not to untap the Armor, and then the buff stays as long as it's tapped. And Rejuvenation Chamber can tap to gain you 2 life, and it has Fading too. These are both very difficult to do anything meaningful with. Flowstone Armor can pick off some small creatures or be useful for a meager stats boost, and Rejuvenation Chamber can gain you a few life before fading away. But in the end, I decided they were way better than 9-Ringed Bow, because even if what they do is underpowered and or meaningless, at least they do something. 9-Ringed Bow just doesn't. It can be tapped to do 1 damage to target spirit, and if that creature would die this turn, you exile it instead. Yeah, this is kind of like Parallax Inhibitor in that it was built with a super specific format in mind. In this case, Kamigawa Block, a series of 3 sets with tons of spirits. But even though it was designed with that format in mind, it's not even worth playing in a world of lots of spirits. Even in the format it was built for, like Kamigawa Block Constructed and Kamigawa Limited, it wasn't worth playing because it just couldn't kill enough spirits to be remotely relevant. I mean, if we look at the whole of Kamigawa Block, there are only 34 spirits with 1 toughness. And of those spirits with 1 toughness, 10 of them have a free sacrifice ability, making the bow irrelevant against them. So you have a very small subset of cards, 24, in a series of sets featuring 621, that the bow actually does something against on its own. And yes, you can use the bow to just finish off a spirit or even just to exile one that's going to die anyway, but neither of those are valuable enough to be worth the mana or a card. So yeah, you can understand why no one played this card even in its optimal environment, and what's crazy is, it's even worse in Magic as a whole, where it's even less likely to see 1 toughness spirits for it to pick off. In most ways, 9-Ringed Bow is just a hunk of metal that sits on the battlefield doing nothing, so playing this thing is a lot like mulliganing, except worse, because you had to pay 3 mana for the privilege of going down a card. I think the worst 4-mana artifact is Golgothian Sylex. It comes with an activated ability that requires you to pay 1 generic and tap it, and then each player sacrifices each non-land permanent they control that has the name of a card that was originally printed in Antiquities. Only being worthwhile against 1 toughness spirits was pretty bad, but only doing something meaningful against cards from a single set, a very small set, is ridiculous. Antiquities only has 85 cards in it. And while there are some that it's nice that this can get rid of, like the Tron lands or Mishra's Workshop, it's also way too slow against those powerful lands to do anything against them before the opponent reaps the rewards of all their mana. Furthermore, the Sylex counts itself, so you can only use this ability a single time. Now, it is true if there had been like Antiquities Draft or Antiquities Only Constructed, this card could have been good, but because the set only had 85 cards, that was impossible. Plus, the idea of Block Constructed and Limited weren't even close to fully formed back in 1994. On top of being a bad card, the Sylex is also just a terrible design. Creating cards that punish entire sets is not only a terrible idea in terms of gameplay. Can you imagine if this had continued and we got a card in every single set that hated on all the cards in it? Yeah, that's just a terrible idea. Let's punish people for buying cards from a single set. Isn't a great business idea either. Talk about feeling bad for starting to play Magic with packs from one set and just getting hosed by this. It's also terrible when it comes to any sort of immersion in the fantasy world of a card game. A card's text mentioning the name of a Magic set is just weird. By the way, City in a Bottle was actually the very first instance of a card like this. It did the same thing, sort of, but for Arabian Nights. So you might have thought it would have showed up at the number 2 mana slot on this list, but it's way better and significantly more useful, as evidenced by several top 8s at high-level vintage events. What makes it so much better? Well, the effect itself is stronger and the card is cheaper. Instead of having an ability that gets rid of itself and all other Antiquities cards already in play, City in a Bottle not only comes down and makes everyone sacrifice all of their Arabian Nights cards that are in play already, it also locks them out of being played as long as it's around. This actually makes City in a Bottle kind of powerful, and it just so happens that one of the best decks in Vintage uses an Arabian Nights card that is usually pretty difficult to stop, Bazaar of Baghdad. People side in the bottle against Bazaar decks since fast mana can actually allow you to get it into play on turn 1, and that pretty much locks every Bazaar deck out of the game if they didn't go first. So the very fact that Mishra's Workshop is also a key card in one of the best decks in Vintage, and yet no one plays the Sylex, goes a long way towards conveying just how bad the Sylex is. So yeah, City in a Bottle also has a terrible, unfun design like the Sylex, but it's actually good in the exact right situation, while Golgothian Sylex is not. In fact, the gap between them is so large that I think Golgothian Sylex is the worst 4-mana artifact ever printed. I think the worst 5-mana artifact is Forethought Amulet, which also might just be the worst artifact of all time. It makes it so that if an instant or sorcery would deal 3 or more damage to you, it does 2 damage instead. We could stop there, and this is already a super expensive, super narrow effect, and it's not like turning bolts into shocks is going to be enough to save you against a burn deck, especially when the card that does this costs so much mana. But the amulet gets even worse, because you have to pay 3 generic during your upkeep every turn, otherwise you sacrifice it. So your options here are basically spending 5 mana just to put a card into your graveyard, or keep it around while it's doing pretty much nothing. I mean, think about it. If you spend 5 to cast this, and then spend 3 every turn to keep it around, is it really going to help you beat your burn opponent who is still just pointing their spells at your face? No, it won't. That makes it yet another card that was designed for a super specific purpose, but it's not even good at that one thing, because it's too slow, doesn't do enough to nerf those spells, and demands an exorbitant upkeep cost just to keep it around. Alright, now we're moving to 6 mana and up. While you should certainly expect something more impactful than Forethought Amulet when you spend 5, once we're talking about 6 and up, it's even more important that these cards do something, since you're spending so much mana to get them going. And my pick for this mana cost, Rakalite, doesn't even get close to clearing this very low bar. It has an activated ability that costs 2 generic, and it lets you prevent the next 1 damage that would be dealt to any target this turn. We could stop there, and this would not be great. It's super expensive to get down, and damage prevention for 2 mana per point isn't great. I mean, you spend 8 total mana to prevent that first point of damage. Look at it that way. However, Rakalite definitely wouldn't be in this video if its effect just let it prevent damage and that was the end of it. It would feel kind of like a bad prison card. I mean, if you're using all your mana on this to not have stuff get damaged, it probably means you're not adding to the board at all and eventually you'd be too far behind to ever be in good shape. But hey, it can prevent damage, and if it did that with no downside, it wouldn't be here. But, of course, it is here because it has a massive downside. Anytime you use its activated ability, you have to return it to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. So that means you have to cast this 6 mana card over and over again to keep preventing damage, and should you have to use it during your own turn for any reason, it won't be in your hand during your opponent's turn, which is a pretty big problem. Basically, this is super mana hungry, demanding 6 mana to get it into play and 2 to use the ability, and then having to recast it for 6 mana is what really makes it terrible. They have it bounce itself as if it's some kind of game-breaking effect, when in reality it just feels like the worst fog ever. Once we're at 7 mana and above, it does become a little harder to find truly horrendous cards, because it seems that the game's designers have, luckily, always realized that if you're spending that much mana, you should probably have something that can impact the board somewhat. And at 7 mana, it was pretty tricky picking a worse card that's on par with the things we've seen so far. This is largely because most 7 mana artifacts do actually add or subtract from the board, making the worst of them just really inefficient creatures like Hexplate Golem or Death Mask Duplicant. As bad as these cards are, at least they do something, which is not something that can be said of everything else we've seen so far. Ultimately, I think the worst of these inefficient 7 mana artifact creatures is Mishra's War Machine. It's a 5/5 with banding, a much maligned keyword, but it is upside. Banding means it can attack with at least one other creature without banding, forming a band with them, and your opponent blocks them as a group. But the part of banding that actually makes it upside is the fact that you always get to control how damage is dealt in combat if you have a creature with banding involved, and that kicks in whether they're attacking in a band or not. And it kicks in if they're blocking. Of course, this is just a 5/5, and if your opponent merely blocks with something big enough to take it down, which is pretty likely by the time you spend 7 mana on this thing, banding is basically meaningless. So this is a 7 mana 5/5 with upside, albeit minimal upside, but it also comes with a downside, of course, because a 7 mana 5/5 is just too good, I guess. And that downside is that you have to discard a card at the beginning of your upkeep, and if you don't, it does 3 damage to you and gets tapped. So yeah, the upside does not match the downside here. And this isn't a case where it's actually worth trying to turn the downside into upside. If you're interested in discarding cards, you can maybe find a way to take advantage of that part of this, but there are so many ways to discard cards whenever you want in Magic that there's no reason to run a creature like this one with way below rate stats and a really narrow window where it lets you discard a card, not to mention a massive punishment if you don't discard that card. You basically have to hold on to a card in your hand or Mishra's War Machine just shuts down, and that's not going to be worth it for your 7 mana 5/5. Once we're talking about 8 mana artifacts, we only have 28 to choose from, and it pretty much comes down to Xanthic Statue versus Aladdin's Ring. Both of them are incredibly expensive artifacts that don't do anything the turn they come down, and then ask for a hefty infusion of mana to start actually doing something. With Xanthic Statue, you can pay 5 generic to make it into an 8/8 until end of turn, and with Aladdin's Ring, you can pay 8 generic and tap it to have it do 4 damage to any target. I don't think I'd fault anyone for choosing either of these as their worst 8 mana artifact, but for me, I think Xanthic Statue is worse. The Ring's ability is expensive, but at least it can directly impact the board in a way that is very clearly of your choosing, whether you use the ability as removal or a way to close out the game by burning the opponent out. Xanthic Statue, meanwhile, can only do one thing: turn into an 8/8 that can attack or block until end of turn. You can attack or block with it to be sure, but your opponent has all the power to make the decisions about what it does. Does it hit them for 8? Is it too small anyway, since you spent 13 total mana on it just to get that first attack in? So yeah, Xanthic Statue is the worst 8 mana artifact because it's expensive and just doesn't give you even a mediocre avenue for actually winning the game, while Aladdin's Ring kinda does. But make no mistake, they're both awful. At 9 mana, there are only 17 artifacts to choose from, and once again, we're talking about a mana cost with lots of super inefficient artifact creatures, including the 5/5 flying Tika's Dragon, but ultimately I think Colossus of Sardia is even worse. It's a 9/9 with trample, which is at least an imposing body for the cost, especially for the 1990s, but the Colossus has a serious problem. It doesn't untap during your untap step. You can pay 9 generic mana to untap it, but you can only do that during your upkeep. One of the few things that can save creatures like this one who refuse to untap unless you pay mana is that you can turn that downside into a bit of upside, because it means you can untap it at instant speed to block and stuff. But the Colossus doesn't let you do it, since you can only activate the ability during your upkeep. So while the Colossus seems more efficient at first than Tika's Dragon, you quickly end up forking over insane amounts of mana just for this to continue to be able to attack, and God forbid your opponent kills it after you sink 9 mana into it to untap it. Basically, spending all that mana on this 9/9 Trampler is a great way to lose a game of Magic. Now, there are only 6 10-mana artifacts in existence, but there is a clear winner when it comes to the worst of them: Aladdin's Lamp. You can pay X mana and tap it, and yes, you do have to tap it for the ability, even though it's not printed on the card. That's because it's a mono artifact, and that now defunct artifact subtype meant you could only use the ability once per turn and tap it after you use it, hence mono. When the subtype was removed, they made it so that these artifacts tap as part of their cost. Anyway, the Lamp's ability cost X mana, and the next time you would draw a card this turn, you instead look at your top X cards and put all but one of them on the bottom of your library in a random order, and then draw a card, and X can't be 0. So this is yet another artifact that is ridiculously mana hungry. I mean, this thing makes you spend 10 mana up front and does stone nothing right away. That mana cost was so ridiculous when this card was printed in Arabian Nights that they didn't even have a 10 mana symbol yet, they just put the 5 mana symbol on it twice. So sure, you can start sinking mana into it for its effect, but that effect does not ever net you a card. All it is card selection, since it's a replacement effect. It lets you choose the best card in your top X to draw, and that's it. Your 10 mana artifact never actually letting you get a card of value out of it is absolutely insane, especially when it demands even more mana to do anything at all. If you have infinite mana, sure, you can turn the lamp into a tutor more or less, but as I said earlier, if you have infinite mana, you're winning because you have infinite mana, not because of Aladdin's lamp, which is an overcosted piece of junk. Casting Aladdin's lamp and then spending a bunch of mana on it is likely to just lose you the game, as your opponents will all just do something that actually matters with their mana, and anytime you're casting the lamp or using its ability, you definitely aren't. So yeah, Aladdin's lamp is very easily the worst 10 mana artifact ever printed. So those are my picks for the worst artifact at every mana value, 0 through 10. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including many more where I look at the worst cards ever printed, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.